All right, ma'am, stop right there. This is the third morning I've seen you out here. Coincidence doesn't happen that many times.
Sir, I live in this neighborhood. I jog every morning. That's all I'm doing.
And every time I'm patrolling, you just happen to cross my path? Looks suspicious to me.
Suspicious for running? It's a fitness routine. I've been doing this for years.
You're circling the same blocks. People who do that are usually scoping out houses.
Dr. Jasmine Reynolds was running her usual morning route through her suburban neighborhood on a Thursday in January at 7:15 in the morning when a police patrol car followed her slowly for almost an entire block before activating its siren. Jasmine was 32 years old, a cardiothoracic surgeon at the local university hospital, and had lived in this upper-middle-class neighborhood for 4 years. She ran this same route 6 mornings a week, always at 7 o'clock, passing the same well-maintained houses and meticulously kept yards. She was wearing gray running clothes, running shoes, and headphones playing workout music. When she heard the siren, she stopped, pulled out her headphones, and turned to see what was happening. 2 officers got out of the patrol car, both looking young, probably early 20s. Their badges identified them as Officer D. Mitchell and Officer K. Stevens. Mitchell approached Jasmine while Stevens stayed near the patrol car. Mitchell said they had received a call about a suspicious person walking through the neighborhood looking at houses. Jasmine looked at Mitchell with genuine confusion. She said she was running, not walking, and that she ran through this neighborhood every day. Mitchell said the call had described a person matching her description looking in house windows. Jasmine asked what description specifically he was referring to. Mitchell hesitated, then said a black woman wearing dark clothes. Jasmine looked at her gray running clothes and said she wasn't wearing dark clothes. Mitchell said she was close enough to the description that they needed to investigate. Jasmine asked what was suspicious about someone running in a residential neighborhood early in the morning. Mitchell said they had been having a series of recent burglaries in the area and were checking any unusual activity. Jasmine said running at 7 in the morning was hardly unusual activity, that half the neighborhood was out running or walking dogs at this time. She gestured to the street where 2 other joggers could be seen in the distance, and a woman walking a dog was passing on the other side. Mitchell said those people hadn't been reported as suspicious. Jasmine felt the implication that she specifically had been reported not for behavior, but for her race. Mitchell asked for identification. Jasmine said she was running and didn't carry a wallet. Mitchell said she needed to provide some form of identification. Jasmine said she lived literally 3 blocks away, that she could walk home and get identification if he really needed it, but that this seemed ridiculous. Mitchell said she needed to provide identification now or would be detained. Jasmine asked under what state law she was required to provide identification when she hadn't committed a crime. Mitchell said she was being investigated for suspicious activity. Jasmine said running wasn't suspicious activity, that she hadn't committed a crime, and that in her state, citizens weren't required to provide identification unless they were suspected of a specific crime. Mitchell seemed uncertain. He looked back at Stevens, who shrugged. Mitchell said if Jasmine refused to cooperate, that was suspicious in itself. Jasmine, who in addition to being a surgeon also had a pre-law degree and had considered law school before choosing medicine, said exercising constitutional rights wasn't suspicious, that she didn't have to prove she belonged in her own neighborhood, that she ran here every day and had never been stopped before, and that she had a strong feeling she was being targeted based on her race rather than any actually suspicious behavior. Mitchell said race had nothing to do with it, that they were just responding to a call. Jasmine said she would like to know exactly what the call had reported. Mitchell said the call had reported a person looking in house windows as if checking if anyone was home. Jasmine said she was running with headphones, looking forward, not at house windows, that she literally did this same run 6 times a week and had never looked in anyone's windows. Mitchell said the caller had been specific about seeing her looking at houses. Jasmine said then either the caller was lying or had confused her with someone else, that she wanted to know who had made the call because if someone was making false reports about her running in her own neighborhood, she had a right to know who was harassing her. Mitchell said caller information was confidential. Jasmine said if someone was making false accusations about her that resulted in being stopped by police, she had a right to confront her accuser. Mitchell said it didn't work that way. Jasmine said then she would find out through other means, and that if someone was making racially motivated calls about black residents in the neighborhood, that was a matter the entire community needed to know about. Mitchell said she was making assumptions about the caller's motivations. Jasmine said they weren't assumptions when she was the only jogger being stopped despite multiple other white joggers doing exactly the same thing in the same neighborhood at the same time. Stevens finally approached and told Mitchell maybe they should let her go since she clearly lived here and was just running. Mitchell said they still hadn't verified she lived here. Jasmine said her house was literally visible from here, the brown brick house 3 blocks down with a silver Subaru in the driveway. Mitchell said that didn't prove anything. Jasmine pulled a house key from a small zippered pocket in her running pants. She showed the key with a keychain that had her address on it. Mitchell said she could have stolen those keys. Jasmine looked at him with disbelief. She said he was clearly looking for any excuse to continue detaining her instead of admitting this was a stop based on a racially biased report. At that moment, Jasmine's neighbor, a middle-aged white man named David Chen, who lived 2 houses down, was leaving for work. He saw Jasmine stopped with 2 police officers and paused. Chen walked over to them and asked what was happening. Jasmine said she was being detained while running. Chen said he knew Jasmine. She had lived in the neighborhood for years. She ran this route every day. Mitchell told Chen this was police business. Chen said he was president of the neighborhood association and had an interest in knowing why a resident was being harassed while running. Stevens said they had received a call about suspicious activity. Chen asked what was suspicious about Jasmine running her route in the morning. Mitchell said the call had reported a person looking in house windows. Chen said he had known Jasmine for 4 years, had never seen her do anything but run through here, and that this sounded like someone making a false report. He pulled out his cell phone and started recording. Mitchell said Chen couldn't record them. Chen said he had an absolute right to record police officers conducting duties in public space, that he was also a retired attorney and knew exactly what his rights were. Mitchell looked frustrated. Stevens whispered something to Mitchell. Jasmine couldn't hear, but Stevens's body language suggested he wanted to end the encounter and leave. Mitchell said they were going to let Jasmine go with a warning. Jasmine asked a warning about what? Mitchell said residents should be aware of their surroundings and report suspicious activity. Jasmine said she didn't need a warning about being aware of surroundings in her own neighborhood where she had lived and run for years, that what she needed was assurance she wouldn't be harassed by officers responding to racially motivated calls. Mitchell said they had just been doing their job. Jasmine said their job was to verify information before detaining citizens, not blindly accept calls that were obviously based on racial bias. Chen said as neighborhood association president, he would be filing a formal complaint about this incident, that Jasmine was a respected surgeon, longtime homeowner, and valued member of the community, that her being stopped while running because someone made a biased call was unacceptable. Mitchell said they had followed protocol responding to a call. Chen said proper protocol would require verifying information before detaining someone, especially when the person was clearly doing normal activity like a morning run. That if they had spent 2 minutes doing basic research, they would have discovered Jasmine was a long-term resident who ran this route regularly. Mitchell and Stevens finally let Jasmine go, but not before Mitchell made a comment that if they received another call about her, she would be detained again. Jasmine said that sounded like a threat of retaliation, and that if she was detained again while legally running in her own neighborhood, she would sue the department and the officers personally. Chen confirmed he had captured the entire interaction on video. After the officers left, Chen told Jasmine that as a retired attorney specializing in civil rights, he thought she had solid grounds for complaint and potentially legal action. Jasmine thanked him and said she would think about it, but first wanted to find out who had made the false call. Jasmine canceled the rest of her run and went home. She arrived home at 7:40, furious and still adrenaline-charged from the encounter. Her husband, Dr. Marcus Reynolds, who was a constitutional law professor at the local university, was making coffee before heading to morning classes. He saw Jasmine's expression and asked what had happened. Jasmine described being stopped, questioned, and detained, despite explaining she was just running in the neighborhood where she lived. Marcus listened with growing anger. As a constitutional law professor, he immediately recognized multiple rights violations. As a husband, he was furious his wife had been harassed while simply running. Marcus said Jasmine should file a formal complaint with the police department and consider legal action. He also said, as president of the local bar association, he had connections that could help obtain the recording of the original call to find out who had made the false report. Jasmine said she wanted to do both. She called work and said she would be an hour late due to an incident she needed to report. Then, she and Marcus went together to the police station to file a formal complaint. At the station, they asked to speak with a supervisor about officer misconduct. They were directed to Sergeant Lisa Martinez, who handled citizen complaints. Martinez listened to Jasmine's description of the incident. Jasmine explained she was running her usual morning route, was stopped by Mitchell and Stevens based on a call about a suspicious person, was questioned despite explaining she lived there, and was detained even after providing a house key showing her address. That Mitchell had suggested she could have stolen the keys instead of simply accepting she was a resident. That she was released only after a neighbor intervened and verified she lived there. And that Mitchell had made a threatening comment about detaining her again if another call was received. Martinez took notes and asked for Chen's contact information as a witness. She said she would review the officer's body cameras and investigate. Marcus then asked about obtaining a copy of the recording of the original call. Martinez said that would require a formal request under public records law. Marcus, a law professor familiar with the process, said he would file the request immediately. Martinez said it would take a few days to process. Marcus said that was fine, but that he expected full cooperation, because if the call had been made with racially motivated malicious intent, the caller needed to be held accountable. Martinez said she understood the concern, but that calls to the tip line were anonymous and protected. Marcus said anonymity didn't protect callers from liability for making deliberately false reports, especially when those reports resulted in violation of their target's rights. Jasmine went to work but had difficulty focusing during surgeries. She kept replaying the encounter in her mind, feeling anger and humiliation at being treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood. During a break between surgeries, she contacted a civil rights attorney she knew through professional networks, attorney Patricia Williams. Patricia listened to the story and said it was a clear case of detention based on racial profiling. That even if a call had been made, officers had an obligation to verify information before detaining someone, especially when the person was doing obviously legal activity like a morning run. That Mitchell's comment about Jasmine possibly having stolen her own house keys demonstrated the bias that was guiding his actions. Marcus's public records request was processed 5 days later. When he received the recording of the call, what he discovered was even worse than he had imagined. The call had been made at 7:03 in the morning, just 12 minutes before Jasmine was stopped. The voice was an older woman's, sounding in her 60s or 70s. She had reported a black woman walking slowly down the street looking at houses like she's looking for which one to break into. When the dispatcher asked what specifically the woman was doing that was suspicious, the caller said, "She clearly doesn't belong in this neighborhood, probably checking which houses are empty so her friends can break in later." The dispatcher asked if the caller had seen the woman try to enter any house or touch any property. The caller said no, but that, "You know how these people are, always casing houses." Marcus was furious listening to it. The call was so obviously motivated by racial bias that even the dispatcher had sounded skeptical. But dispatch had sent Mitchell and Stevens to investigate anyway. Marcus immediately contacted Martinez and requested a meeting to discuss the recording. Martinez listened to the recording and admitted the caller's language was problematic. Marcus said problematic was an understatement, that it was explicitly racist, that the caller hadn't described any actually suspicious behavior, just assumed a black woman in the neighborhood must be casing houses because these people are like that. That dispatch should have recognized the call was based on racial bias and not sent officers, or at least should have instructed officers to verify the person was actually doing something suspicious before detaining. Martinez said she would take this to higher supervisors. But Marcus wanted more than internal investigation. He wanted to know who had made the call. Martinez said calls were anonymous. Marcus said tip line calls captured caller ID automatically for emergency cases, that he wanted that information. Martinez said it would require a court order. Marcus said then he would get a court order because if someone was making racially motivated false calls that resulted in his wife being illegally detained, that person needed to face legal consequences. Patricia Williams, Jasmine's civil rights attorney, joined Marcus in seeking a court order for the caller's information. It took 2 weeks, but a judge granted the order requiring the police department to disclose the caller's information based on finding that the call contained racially biased language and resulted in detention of an innocent citizen. The phone number traced to Margaret Whitmore, a 72-year-old woman who lived on the same street as Jasmine, 6 houses down. Whitmore was a longtime homeowner who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. When Patricia contacted Whitmore informing her that legal action was being considered for her false call, Whitmore initially denied making any call. But when confronted with the recording, she changed her story, saying she had just been trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Patricia explained that making a false report to police based on racial bias that resulted in detention of an innocent person was both a crime and basis for civil liability. That Whitmore had specifically used racially biased language describing Jasmine as not belonging to the neighborhood and making reference to these people. Whitmore defended herself, saying she had lived in the neighborhood for decades and didn't recognize Jasmine. Patricia pointed out Jasmine had lived there for 4 years and ran past Whitmore's house 6 mornings a week. That if Whitmore didn't recognize her, it was because Whitmore didn't pay attention to black residents or assumed they didn't belong. Whitmore became defensive, saying she had a right to report suspicious activity. Patricia said running wasn't suspicious activity and that Whitmore's call hadn't described any actually suspicious behavior beyond a black woman walking down the street. The story leaked to local media when an investigative reporter obtained a copy of the call recording through public records request. When the recording was played on the evening news, public reaction was immediate and furious. Whitmore's racially biased language, particularly the comment, "You know how these people are," was widely condemned. Black residents from across the city shared similar stories of being stopped, questioned, or having police called on them while doing perfectly normal activities in their own communities. The neighborhood association called an emergency meeting. Chen, as president, opened the meeting explaining that one of their respected residents, Dr. Jasmine Reynolds, had been detained by police while running based on a racially motivated call from another resident. The neighborhood association meeting was tense. Over 60 residents attended, an unusually high number for a neighborhood meeting. Jasmine and Marcus were there, as were Chen and his wife. Whitmore didn't attend, but several of her friends came in her defense. Chen played the recording of the call for the entire assembly to hear. The awkward silence that followed the "you know how these people are" comment was broken by multiple residents expressing shock and anger. A Latina woman who lived in the neighborhood said she too had been questioned by neighbors about whether she was a cleaning lady despite owning her house there. An Asian man said he had been stopped while walking his dog and asked if he was making deliveries. One of Whitmore's friends tried to defend her, saying Whitmore had just been concerned about neighborhood safety given recent burglaries. Chen responded that concern for safety didn't justify assuming any person of color was suspicious, that the burglaries had been committed by 2 white teenagers who had been arrested 3 weeks earlier, that there was no factual basis for associating crime with residents of color, and that Whitmore's call had specifically used racially biased language that had nothing to do with actual behavior and everything to do with Jasmine's race. The meeting voted overwhelmingly to issue a statement condemning Whitmore's call and expressing support for Jasmine. The internal affairs investigation into Mitchell and Stevens' conduct was concluded 4 weeks after the incident. Findings were that the officers had failed to adequately verify information before detaining Jasmine, that once it became clear she was running and lived in the neighborhood, they should have ended the encounter immediately. That Mitchell's comment about Jasmine possibly having stolen her own house keys was inappropriate and suggested bias, and that his threatening comment about detaining her again if another call was received was improper. The recommendation was mandatory additional training on racial profiling and how to evaluate calls before detaining citizens, but no formal disciplinary action. Patricia Williams filed the federal civil lawsuit 6 weeks after the incident. The lawsuit named Mitchell and Stevens personally, the police department for failure to adequately train, and Margaret Whitmore for making a malicious false report that resulted in Jasmine's illegal detention. The allegations against the officers were Fourth Amendment violation through detention without reasonable cause and 14th Amendment violation through equal protection, alleging Jasmine was targeted based on race. The allegations against Whitmore included false reporting, defamation through calling Jasmine a criminal to police, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And the lawsuit alleged the department had failed to train officers on how to recognize and reject calls based on racial bias. Patricia's complaint included a 50-page analysis of case law on racial profiling, liability for false calls, and reasonable cause standards. It included complete transcript of the call recording with analysis of racially biased language. It included Chen's video showing Jasmine being questioned and detained. And it included statements from multiple neighbors confirming Jasmine ran that route regularly and had never done anything suspicious. The lawsuit sought $500,000 in damages from the officers and department and $100,000 from Whitmore personally. But more importantly, it sought comprehensive policy reforms in how the department handled potentially bias-based calls. The police department and city tried to settle once the call recording had become public, and community reaction was so negative. Initial offer was $150,000 and commitment to some training. Patricia rejected it as inadequate given Jasmine was a well-known physician, that the call had been so obviously racist, and that officers had failed to do basic verification before detaining. Negotiations continued. The city increased to $300,000 with policy reforms. Patricia counter-offered $550,000 with specific reforms. Final settlement was reached at $475,000, with Mitchell and Stevens each personally liable for $20,000 through wage garnishments, and Whitmore personally liable for $50,000 through sale of assets. But as in all previous cases, policy reforms were where the real transformative impact was. The settlement required the department to implement a screening system for tip line calls, specifically designed to identify and filter bias-based calls. Dispatchers had to be trained to ask specific questions when calls described suspicious activity involving people of color, including asking the caller what specific behavior they observed beyond the person's presence, whether the person touched any property, and whether the caller recognized the person as not being a resident. If a call contained language suggesting racial bias or didn't describe actually suspicious behavior, dispatchers had to flag the call as potentially bias-based and instruct officers to verify carefully before detaining. Every officer had to complete 40 hours of training on recognizing racially biased calls and how to verify information before detaining citizens doing lawful activities. Training included specific modules on the difference between genuinely suspicious activity and people simply existing in public spaces. On understanding that running, walking, sitting in cars, or being in neighborhoods wasn't inherently suspicious regardless of person's race, and on how to do quick verification, like asking the person to describe where they live or asking neighbors if they recognize the person before escalating to detention. Officers who failed to do appropriate verification before detaining an innocent citizen would face disciplinary action. The settlement also established a false caller accountability program. Anyone making a tip line call using racially biased language or making a false report that resulted in detention of an innocent person would be identified and could face criminal charges for false reporting. And the department had to publish quarterly data on how many tip line calls involved reports of people of color doing normal activities, and how many of those calls resulted in discovery of actual criminal activity versus discovery of no crime. This transparency was intended to demonstrate the broader pattern of bias-based calls. Jasmine donated her portion of the settlement, minus compensation for lost work time and emotional costs, to establish a Freedom of Movement Fund, providing free legal assistance for people of color who faced detention or harassment while doing normal everyday activities in their communities. The fund also developed a public awareness campaign educating residents about how normal activities like running, walking, sitting in cars, or being in public spaces weren't suspicious regardless of person's race. And the fund created a hotline people could call to report when they had been targeted by bias-based calls, creating a database of incidents that could be used to identify areas or individuals with patterns of making racially motivated calls. Margaret Whitmore faced significant social ostracism. Multiple neighbors stopped speaking to her. Her church, after hearing the recording, asked her to complete racial reconciliation training before continuing in leadership roles. And her own family expressed shame at her actions. When reporters contacted her a year after the incident, she maintained she had done nothing wrong, that she had a right to report suspicious activity. But when pressed on what specific behavior of Jasmine's had been suspicious, she couldn't articulate anything beyond she didn't look like she belonged here, revealing that even after a year in lawsuit and social ostracism, she still didn't understand that assuming people of color didn't belong in suburban neighborhoods was racial bias. Mitchell and Stevens faced different career consequences. Mitchell, who had made comments about Jasmine possibly having stolen keys and the threat about detaining her again, was placed on 6-month probation and required to complete 80 hours of training on racial profiling. He remained with the department but was never promoted. Stevens, who had tried to suggest letting Jasmine go and hadn't made inappropriate comments, completed mandatory training and was eventually promoted to detective. The difference in career trajectories sent a clear message that how officers handled situations mattered, that an officer who recognized error and tried to de-escalate was treated differently from an officer who doubled down on biased actions. The case received national attention not just because the victim was a prominent surgeon, but because it resonated with countless people of color who had had police called on them while existing in public spaces. Stories went viral on social media about people having police called for barbecuing at a park, sleeping in a university dorm where they lived, entering their own apartment building, or sitting in Starbucks. Each incident followed the same pattern: white person assuming person of color didn't belong, calling police, and person of color being detained or questioned despite doing perfectly legal activity. Jasmine's case became a textbook example used in training programs about how these incidents harmed both targeted individuals and broader community relations. Years after the incident, Jasmine still ran the same route, though now sometimes with apprehension she hadn't felt before. She never saw Whitmore during runs, though she knew Whitmore still lived 6 houses down. She developed closer friendships with Chen and other neighbors who had supported her, and she became a speaker on racial profiling in residential contexts, giving talks at medical conferences, law enforcement training programs, and community events. She always ended presentations with the same point, that being a physician, homeowner, respected community member hadn't protected her from being treated like a criminal while running in her own neighborhood. That if she, with all the resources and legal knowledge available to her, faced such treatment, how vulnerable people without those resources were. Marcus used the case in constitutional law teaching, having students analyze the call recording, detention video, and legal documents from the lawsuit. Students discussed what Fourth Amendment protections meant in practice, how racial bias subverted those protections, and what legal remedies were available when rights were violated. Many of his students who became lawyers or judges later credited Jasmine's case with helping them understand concretely how constitutional rights applied in real-life contexts. The neighborhood association implemented its own reforms. They created a welcoming program for new residents, specifically emphasizing the neighborhood was diverse and inclusive. They organized regular community events designed to help neighbors get to know each other, so longtime residents would recognize all neighbors, not just those who look like them. And they established a clear policy that members shouldn't call police about neighbors unless they witnessed actual criminal activity, not merely the presence of a person they didn't recognize. The $545,000 total settlement and comprehensive reforms sent a clear message. Making racially motivated false calls had consequences, including personal financial liability. Police departments had to train officers and dispatchers to recognize bias-based calls and verify information before detaining citizens. And communities had to confront residents who assumed people of color didn't belong. Jasmine's case proved that even in progressive suburban neighborhoods, even when the victim was a highly educated professional, racial profiling still occurred, but that when it did, there were paths to accountability. Chen's video remained online, viewed millions of times. It captured a moment where the privilege of moving freely through public spaces that many took for granted was denied to a black woman simply running in her own neighborhood. Surgeon in running clothes, calmly explaining she lived there while being treated as suspect. Officer making assumptions based on racially biased call, and white neighbor having to intervene to verify she belonged. It was a lesson about racial profiling, about how biased calls created illegal detentions, and about the importance of neighbors standing up for each other. For Jasmine, that Thursday morning when she should have been completely focused on her morning run transformed from healthy routine into trauma that took months to process. She developed anxiety about running, always wondering if someone would call police again. But she channeled that anxiety into action, using her own experience to educate others, forcing reforms that would help future residents of color, and establishing legal precedent that making racially motivated false calls had consequences. The woman who called police about her not belonging learned through $50,000 in liability and social ostracism that racist assumptions were expensive. The officers who detained her without proper verification learned that failing to question bias-based calls damaged careers, and the community learned that confronting racism among neighbors was everyone's responsibility. The case's legacy was multifaceted. Whitmore lost $50,000 in respected position in community, serving as warning about making bias-based calls. Mitchell faced probation and career stagnation, demonstrating officers who doubled down on biased actions paid professional price. The department implemented reforms that benefited all citizens by creating screening for bias-based calls. And people of color in the community gained resources through Jasmine's Freedom of Movement Fund. A single 15-minute encounter on a quiet suburban street had exposed systemic bias and forced changes that rippled through law enforcement and residential communities. Chen occasionally ran with Jasmine on weekend mornings, both for companionship and solidarity. He said that as an Asian man, he too had experienced being questioned in spaces where he belonged, but recognized Jasmine's experiences as a black woman involved additional layers of suspicion and threat. Their friendship, forged through him standing up for her that morning, became an example of how allies could use privilege to challenge unfair treatment of neighbors. For Jasmine, justice didn't erase the humiliation of being treated like a criminal while running in her own neighborhood. It didn't remove the fear she felt when Mitchell suggested she could have stolen her own house keys. It didn't undo the anxiety she carries every time she runs now, always slightly alert for any patrol car that might stop her again. But justice provided validation that her perceptions of racial profiling were correct, that the system could work when victims had resources and allies, and that one person standing up for rights could create change protecting countless others. And that validation, that systemic change, that precedent establishing accountability for racially motivated callers, was the kind of justice that mattered beyond monetary compensation.